Hello everyone, my name is Heather Sain-Hava. I'm Director of Corporate Marketing at Intellident. Today I'm here with Glenn Tyndall, CTO and co-founder, to talk about the issue of insider threat. So Glenn, when most people think about network security, they're concerned about the external threat, those outside the firewall. But you believe that insider threat is an equally important issue. Why do you think that?
Heather, the reason is due to the fact that employees commonly have access to systems and to network infrastructure with usernames and passwords that can allow them to touch and affect a significant amount of change to that infrastructure. I can actually point to a number of examples. The first is a situation in San Francisco where a gentleman was a network administrator, had the common root or enable password to the vast majority of the infrastructure. A situation arose where he was not willing to share that password with anyone else and ended up being arrested, and the result was the fact that the mayor of San Francisco had to go down to the police station and make a request to get the password back. In the end, it was a situation where no one was allowed to touch any of the infrastructure without that password, yet this gentleman was able to hold it hostage. A second example is a situation where a disgruntled employee ended up serving jail time due to the fact that they had access to infrastructure and systems in an unauthorized way, and it allowed that individual to make modifications to the infrastructure, change passwords, delete information, change processes that had a significant impact to the business. The third example that I could point to is a situation, again, where a gentleman ends up with jail time. The unfortunate part, again, is the fact that because a person had access to the information, the person had access to the usernames and passwords that allowed them to touch that information, it creates a situation where a large exposure exists on behalf of the company. I would like to point to a 2008 Global Information Security Workforce Study by Frost and Sullivan that states 51% of IT executives and security professionals consider internal employees to be the single biggest threat to security infrastructure, to the security and the infrastructure.
So Glenn, will you give us some examples of how this insider threat issue manifests inside an IT organization?
I would be glad to. First of all, it is really a pretty common situation where in operational organizations, username and password information is pretty commonly shared. The reasons commonly are because an individual who's been tasked with getting a job done might not have the privileges under his own username, his or her own username and password, and they, if you will, borrow someone else's username and password that has a greater level of privilege, allowing them to make the changes they feel like are necessary to the infrastructure. Second is a situation where that same person may not be authorized. So I can get access to the infrastructure, but I'm not authorized to make particular types of changes. And so I can borrow, if you will, another username and password account, log in, and I now have a degree of authorization I did not have previously. Another situation is the fact that the person just says, hey, it's the middle of the night, my partner is out, I don't want to have to call that person up to come into the business and make a change or modification or fix a problem. So I'm just going to go ahead and get the job done on my own accord, and I'm going to use a username and a password, in particular the password being the critical issue that will allow me to do that. And then finally, it's a situation where commonly we see it's very difficult to make changes to the infrastructure without the knowledge of usernames and passwords, so people just typically just want to step in and do what they need to do.
So that's great, Glenn, but isn't that why organizations are investing in really complicated solutions like cryptography, biometrics, and generally speaking, security event management solutions?
You're correct, but it's kind of interesting given the fact that there's actually some low-hanging fruit that exists that are probably not pointed to, and this low-hanging fruit can actually mitigate a portion of the problem. Three examples are compliance management, configuration management, and change management. In all three cases, they simplify the problem, they introduce a level of discipline to the process, and it fosters an environment where I can run a set of audits on a daily basis or even after a set of changes have occurred, allowing me to understand what occurred, who made the change, when it was changed, who might have approved it, but ultimately I also have a mechanism by which I can audit and determine, has that change created an exposure to me, and if so, I need to take a step and do something about it. I can now take you through the 1, 2, 3 steps to tackling the insider threat. The first is strong password policies and enforcement therein. Typically what we find is that usernames and passwords, usernames less so, the passwords in particular can be rather simplified. An example of that would be a person's name or a common object that exists, you know, rock or go or something along those lines. What we would want to see is something that's much stronger than that, something that's enforced on a regular basis, and the process is changed, or we force a process that makes the passwords get changed on a regular basis. The second is a situation where I automate configuration, policy, and change management processes so that I know the infrastructure is going through a process of self-policing the infrastructure, fostering alerts, things that are necessary to notify activities ongoing and where exposures may exist. And then finally, we want to ensure that we provide a high level of training and education. When you look at the ebb and flow that occurs with people coming into an organization and leaving, when a new person comes in, you want to make sure you have taught that new person what typical processes, procedures are to run the business effectively and adhere to our compliance standards. And if a person is leaving the organization, we want to make sure we introduce into the infrastructure a password change process such that that person doesn't leave, and for a long period of time that username password exposure continue to exist.
So what can Intellident do specifically to help solve the insider threat issue?
We can actually point to 4 general things. The first is granular access control, the theme being who has access to what devices and what parts of those configurations. We want to ensure that an individual in an operational environment especially sees no more but no less than is necessary for them to get their job done. The second case is always on compliance. We want to make sure that after every change or very frequently during a day, we ensure that their compliance exists through a constant state of audit, and we check those policies on a regular basis to make sure that there's not been any changes to those policies, but the theme again being one of compliance and auditability in a self-policing infrastructure. The third would be change management. Who can make what change, when, where, why, and how, and an approval process such that where a change may occur that does or potentially could foster an exposure, such as a password change, some other individual has had the opportunity to review it, ensure that it's going to be correct, that it adheres to standard, and then approve it and allow it to occur. And then finally, documentation, documentation, documentation. We need to log everything that goes on and have that information archived such that if an exposure does exist, we have the ability to go back, go through a process of root cause analysis, determine where the exposure was, what steps we took to rectify it, and then move on from there. I can point to 2 examples that Intellident does provide. In this particular case, this is what we refer to as a command set. Imagine that it's nothing more than a change that can happen globally. The user of the system doesn't have to know syntax and semantics. It's simply a parameter that gets prompted, allows the person to type in the password that adheres to the standards that we want to commonly see, and then the change can automatically take place throughout the infrastructure. Another example that we can point to are things such as PCI DSS compliance, where we can implement AAA policies, we can audit on a regular basis, and ensure that there's a high level of data protection.
Well, thank you, Glenn, for your time today. For more information on this topic and Intellident solutions, please visit our website at www.intellident.com or email us at netnovo@intellident.com. Thank you.